Today's topic is a theology of martyrdom. I simply want to give my own reflections upon actually more on the effects of martyrdom than actually martyrdom itself. I'm presuming that you students have watched the videos on YouTube, Why Do the Romans Persecute Christians? This Religion for Breakfast. I find this young scholar, very interesting and very much in line what I believe about in early Christian martyrdom. Also, the introduction to Martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas. You should have read the text, and also seen these two videos. And there's one called Perpetua and Christian Persecution in the Roman Empire. And so based on that, I just want to give my own reflections upon this in terms of what we would call a theology of martyrdom, and that is that already early Christians knew of martyrdom. We've heard this story in class already about the Maccabees. This is, of course, the Maccabees is the background of Hanukkah, the Jewish tradition. We know that this woman and her 7 sons choose martyrdom rather than submitting to basically the Greek religion, so forth, wanting to be faithful to Judaism. We know that in early Christianity, one of the first martyrs is Saint Stephen, my namesake, whose feast day is celebrated on December 26th, by the way. He himself was persecuted and died for the faith. We know that in the book of Revelations, that last text of the New Testament, martyrs are considered to be what they call blood witnesses. They themselves have been bathed in the blood of Christ and now have the honor of wearing white garments and symbols of resurrected life. But we know that, and I hope you've learned this from the videos that you've been watching, that early Christians were not persecuted because they worshiped Jesus. Romans had no difficulty of that. It's that they would not worship the Roman gods nor the emperor. And so that refusal of this, and this is, of course, gets into the situation of Perpetua. As we know, Perpetua, she was a new Christian, and she really believed that she could not worship the other gods as a Christian, and therefore she was martyred. We know that this has a tremendous influence, this whole theme of martyrdom in these first couple centuries of Christianity. It had an effect on literature, because we know that a new type of literature was formed at this time. These took place called either the Passiones or the Acta. These are the acts like you've read with the life of Perpetua, that martyrdom, that these are acts. They show, very important for the Christians, it was showing how these individuals were martyred and so forth. And so in terms of literature, we have a new type of literature. This is going to have a tremendous influence all the way up until the time of the Reformation, in terms of what we call Vita Christi. These are or not Vita Christi, I mean, those are the life of Christ, about the life of the saints. And so these collection of materials about individual saints became a very popular religion all the way up and through into time of the Reformation. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that later on. But anyway, in terms of a theology of martyrdom, very simply put, early Christians, certain ones, felt they were called by this. This was their vocation, their call. And either this came from their own experience of reading scriptures, or in the case of Perpetua, she was receiving these visions. And so, regardless of the source of this, they themselves know that they will not worship gods in faithfulness to Jesus and that relationship that they have with him, but they feel that they are called to this. They believe that they are chosen by God for this. And so as we would consider our own vocation to a certain occupation, or I am called to a relationship with a particular person in terms of a spousal relationship, so forth, a significant other, that they really did believe that they had a vocation, a call to this. Secondly, they themselves thought that they were imitating Jesus in his own sufferings. Remember, the passion of Jesus is so is strong. Hopefully we'll talk about this when we get to the Middle Ages with Francis of Assisi, but they believed they were participating in the sufferings of Christ. We see this especially in Perpetua. They believed that they were fighting the devil in resisting this, and of course this is where they associated worship of the devil with the worship of the Roman Empire and of the Roman gods. This sort of athletic imagery becomes very strong. In fact, one of the most peculiar things in the text of the Martyrdom Perpetua was when the young soldier is kind of resisting sticking the sword into her, that she actually reaches out and actually does it herself. And one of the issues of this is basically that she herself wants to make sure that it is a thing of she is willing this. So not only is her vocation, but it's also this thing of willing to participate in the sufferings of Christ. We know that there were not only martyrs, but they were called confessors. These people, confessors, were people that were faced with a situation of martyrdom, but for some reason or not, they were not executed. And these people became very important because they were still living, and people sought them out because they thought of their holiness. They thought that they should be sought, especially when you were dealing with serious sin and asking for forgiveness. We know, and I'm going to do a separate video on this in terms of the consequence of martyrdom on baptism, but we know that, just briefly stating it here, that the great promises of the gospel in terms of baptism were given to them if they went through this martyrdom: the forgiveness of sins, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and eternal life. And if you've read the martyrdom of Perpetua very carefully, remember she calls this, in that text, it is called the second baptism. If you were not baptized formally, if you went through this martyrdom, it was considered to be a baptism in blood of Christ. In the text itself, it's referred to as saved and washed, so it is a second baptism. There is a whole cult of martyrs that is associated with this, and this takes on a number of different things. The cult of the martyrs, cult not in the sense of like a little religious, strange religious group that meets in hiding and stuff as we maybe find today, but this means the whole kind of celebration of these individual martyrs and groups of martyrs. That part of the thing is that the belief is that when they were martyred, they went immediately up to heaven, and therefore they believe that they are at the sort of the right hand of Jesus, who is at the right hand of God, and they felt that there's this intercession. In fact, the remains of these saints, called the relics, there was a cult around these because they felt that these pieces of flesh that were left, whatever was left, and by the way, Romans tried to get rid of all this, burn it all, because they didn't want this happening. But they felt that this virtus, this sort of power, as it's expressed in Latin, was still with that presence. The spiritual presence was still in those individual things. And so these relics themselves become very important. But also, as I mentioned, people sought these saints, these saint martyrs, for intercession. They believed that they had the ear of God, and therefore they were to be prayed for. We also know that this is part of the cult of the saints is what is called the communion of saints. It's these people that they believe are in paradise, and so this gathering of them, they are around that communion of saints, and we can then have them intercede for us in terms of people who are still on earth. Also, that we know that around the these meals, and this is very common in the ancient world, of on the anniversary of death, of having a celebration. People would go out to the catacombs, for example, and they would have these funeral meals on the anniversary of death. And so part of this was to have a celebration, a sort of a banquet around the person who is dead, but especially the martyrs. We also know that this really changes the whole notion of calendar. Remember that during the course of the year, we're so used to having the school calendar determine our things, but when you have these anniversaries of the individual martyrs, what develops is you begin to have what we call feast days. And so feast days are these celebrations on the day of that person's death, which meant a new life. So it was really their birthday. That around that day, these days become feast days, and so the calendar begins to change, and this goes through all the way until the time of the Reformation, the 16th century. That you determine the calendar was determined by Feast of Jesus, Feast of Mary, and the Feast of the Saints. And so your calendar, like we would have 4th of July, Easter, Christmas, Labor Day, Memorial Day, and stuff like this, their calendar was determined by all of these feast days during the entire year. And so those became, so the calendar changes here. We also know that this had a tremendous influence in architecture, because not only did you begin to have reliquaries of these little, these sort of monstrances, these things to house the pieces of martyrs that were left, but also when you had intact bodies and stuff like this, there were churches and chapels dedicated to these things, and so you have these buildings. In fact, if you go to Rome, near the Colosseum, there's a church called Santo Stefano. Apparently, according to tradition, the body of Stefano was brought to Rome, and there the building is in an octagon, and you would actually, in the centerpiece of it was the altar, and underneath that would be Santo Stefano. This is 8-sided building, and you would there were these colonnades, and you would circumambulate around the altar where the martyr was below. And so part of this is circumambulation becomes sort of a pilgrim practice, and it's honoring that saint that is buried below. And therefore, the certain structures are built now to house these individual martyrs. And there's a whole issue of architecture that comes into this, and especially when you get into the Gothic period, but I don't have time to go into that right now. And one of the issues, of course, is of veneration. We do not worship these martyrs, and especially the relics. As in Eastern Christianity, we speak about the difference between worship and veneration. We only worship God as a Christian, but we venerate those things like icons, these images of art images of saints and of Mary and of Jesus and so forth like this. But there's a special veneration that is given to the martyrs, of these saints. And therefore, this is part of the whole cult in terms of the calendar, about architecture, about baptism. I'm going to return back to the theme of baptism in a next lecture. So this is a simple presentation on what we call the theology of early martyrdom. Ciao.